start the recording. Cool. First up, the agenda tonight. First up will be our speaker for tonight, Associate Professor Katherine Moseby, coming to us via Zoom technology from her project site in the northern part of South Australia. I think I've got that right, have I, Katherine?
Yep, that's correct.
Great. Then after the presentation and associated Q&A, we'll move on to general business. For the other Zoomers out there, first of all, a reminder to please mute your microphones if not already done, so we can't hear any background noise from your place. During the presentation, I ask you all to keep your microphones muted. For the Q&A session, you can ask questions by virtually raising your hand in the reactions box or using the chat function to send a message to the host that you would want to ask a question, or you can type the question into the message and it can be read out for you. Please mute your microphone after asking your question. For those here in the audience, please raise your hand and I will ask you to come up here to the front so that you can be heard through this microphone, and it goes out into the Zoom land. So I'll ask you to come up the front to ask your question, and then Katherine will be able to hear it as well, our speaker. So our speaker tonight, moving along, is Associate Professor Katherine Moseby, a Conservation Biologist at the University of New South Wales, on the topic of rewilding Australia's threatened mammals. Australia has the highest recent extinction rate in the world, and our desert mammals have been disproportionately affected. Rewilding seeks to restore threatened mammal species to areas where they are locally extinct, whilst also reinstating important ecosystem processes. This talk will highlight some rewilding successes in Australia and the methods used to return native mammals to parts of their former range. Katherine lives and works in Australia's arid and semi-arid zones, and her research interests include ecosystem restoration, facilitating coexistence of native species and introduced predators, and improving the reintroduction success of threatened species. So with that brief introduction, I'll hand over to Katherine to you. Thanks, Katherine.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay and see the screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, everything all right? Yes, we're all good.
Okay, sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I'm actually at one of my field sites, but it's actually a property that we own on the Eyre Peninsula. So I just thought I would show you that property, which is this one here. So we live at Secret Rocks, which is on the eastern Eyre Peninsula in South Australia, and we bought about 300 square kilometres of land that was pastoral lease, and we put it under conservation. And it's one of my study sites. I have a few different study sites. It's mallee woodland and it's semi-arid, so it's only got about 250 millimetres of rain a year. And one of the reasons we bought it is because it's got the nationally threatened malleefowl, which is a pretty amazing mound-dwelling bird, and you guys probably know quite a bit about malleefowl and how they use leaf litter to incubate their eggs. So we have about 800 mounds on our property, but not all of them are active. We only have up to about 50 active per year. And one of the conservation projects we did out here at Secret Rocks is we had a student try and catch some of these malleefowl and fit them with radio transmitters. And that's the bird on the left. You can see he's wearing a backpack, and it's a satellite download. So we were able to see what these birds were doing and try and understand what was threatening them a bit more. And unfortunately, the PhD student found that 5 out of 8 of them died within a year of having these transmitters on, and these are supposed to be long-lived birds. And one died during a heat wave. So we had really high mortality of these birds, and we were able to sort of swab some of the carcasses and send them off for DNA analysis. And it was, foxes and cats that were causing most of those issues. And no surprise, really. I mean, foxes and cats have been part of what's caused a lot of extinctions of Australia's mammals, along with things like land degradation and clearance, things like rabbits, cattle and sheep, causing a decline in land conditions. So we've had sort of a lot of these issues in arid zone areas, and that's usually the main culprits that have contributed towards extinctions. And so as it was introduced at the start, we have lost over 34 mammal extinctions, and the arid zone has been disproportionately affected. In some parts of the arid zone where I work, we've lost 60% of the arid mammals in that area. So it's really been quite a damage that's happened in those areas. And when you think about 70% of Australia being arid or semi-arid, then you're talking about a large part of Australia that's been altered forever by having these mammals disappear. And it's not just the mammals themselves, it's all the ecosystem services they provided, like their digs, their foraging pits that used to collect seeds and increase carbon and water infiltration in the soil. So there's a lot of those processes that are now gone. So a lot of people have put effort into trying to restore these arid zone mammals into the environment. And if you look at the history of these reintroduction projects, they've all failed. So things like Desert Dreaming, which was one that Western Australia did in the 80s, Yathong with woylies, narwhal wallabies, the list goes on. They all failed due to cat or fox predation. And has really led, I think, in the last 25 to 30 years to this creation of what we call safe havens. So these are fenced conservation reserves and islands. So we've got a lot of offshore islands where we've removed the cats and foxes and we've reintroduced a lot of these threatened mammals. But we've also got now island safe havens where we've built these fences to exclude cats and foxes and sometimes rabbits. And then we've reintroduced those locally extinct native mammals into those areas. And why do we do them? They work. We put a fence up, we get rid of the cats and foxes, we reintroduce these species back in, and most of the time we get successful translocations. We get animals increasing in number and breeding up, and it's been a really important method for trying to stop species extinction in many parts of Australia, particularly in the arid zone. These fence reserves are not just Australia. We've got them in New Zealand, in Europe, in Hawaii, Japan. The one on the left is a mongoose exclusion fence for the Okinawa Rail in Japan. And the one on the right is in Wellington in New Zealand, and that's to keep out stoats and rats and mice and allow kiwis and other birds to flourish in there. So they're a popular tool throughout the world, not just in Australia. We do have a lot of them. We started off with 5 about 25 years ago, and we're now more than 35, getting close to 40. And they're spread all around Australia. Most of them are quite small, some only a few hundred hectares. The largest one is 123 square kilometres, but most of them are a lot smaller than that. And one of them that I work on and I co-founded 25 years ago is the Arid Recovery Reserve. This is in Roxby Downs in northern South Australia, and it's definitely arid. We get about 150 millimetres of rain a year, so very dry area. And we've gradually been building exclosures there. And you can see on the left there, there's actually 6 different exclosures now, with a total of 123 square kilometres. And this is the largest safe haven in Australia at the moment. New Haven, which is one of AWC's ones, is slightly smaller. But at the moment, this is the largest one. And the reason we started building exclosure was that in 1995, rabbit calicivirus was released accidentally in Australia, and we saw this huge decline in rabbits. And that huge decline in rabbits also led to a huge decline in cats and foxes. And we thought, well, this would be a great opportunity to try and permanently remove those 3 pest species from a large area and try and re-establish some of those threatened species that no longer existed there. So that was the impetus for the project. It was funded by Western Mining, which was then taken over by BHP Billiton, and it's a partnership with Bush Heritage as well and conservation organisations. And we've managed to reintroduce 6 threatened species to that area. including the bilby, the sharp-bayed bandicoot, the western quoll, the stick-nest rat, the quarry, and the burrowing bettong. And some of these species are only found on offshore islands. So the sharp-bayed bandicoot used to be across most of southern Australia, now only found on 2 islands in Western Australia. The burrowing bettong on 3 islands in Western Australia, and the stick-nest rat on 1 island in South Australia. So a lot of these animals are really down to just a few thousand left in the wild on 1 or 2 islands. So we were able to bring those species over and reintroduce them at arid recovery. This is one of the animals we reintroduced, the burrowing bettong. It started digging up the soil and creating these foraging pits that I talked about before, and we got a lot of seeds germinating and a lot of water infiltration. I'm not sure if this sound is going to work, but I just wanted to sort of show you that the soundscape also changed. And this is a burrowing bettong alarm call. Not sure if it's going to work. No, it's not going to work. It's and this is no, I didn't think that was going to work, but anyway, I thought it was worth a try. So the soundscapes change in the environment as well. It's not just the physical things you can see, it's also the sounds you hear at night, it's the smells, it's the foraging pits and the vegetation. So all these things have sort of changed within this reserve since we've added these animals. And they're really important, these safe havens. They help improve our understanding. We do a lot of monitoring to try and understand what the country was like before we introduced all these feral animals into Australia and cleared it and removed Indigenous occupation. So we do a lot of monitoring of the flora and fauna. We also do a lot of education and public participation, and this is really important. People can come out and see these animals. People can actually get a chance to interact with nature, and that's something that we see less and less of. People having less gardens and less time spent outside, so it's really important to have these places where kids and people can interact with nature. We do a lot of training. We have a lot of research students that come through and also school students, and they get a chance to come out and learn about Arizona ecology. That's some of the real positives that we have with these fence reserves across Australia. However, we also have some downsides. They're very, very expensive. This is some of the costs per kilometre for some of the fence reserves that we have managed to get costs for. So, you can easily spend $1 million to build, remove pests and reintroduce species from, quite a small area. You're talking about only maybe 20 or 30 square kilometres. So there's a lot of money that goes into it that's got to fund it. And then you've got the replacement and maintenance costs. And this example here, this is arid recovery's fence. And you see when it touches the sand, it starts to rust. And within about 10 or 15 years, we have to replace that foot netting and start again. And that's, that's a lot of money to do that every 10 or 15 years. So there's a lot of expense there. That can also cause breeding and loss of genetic diversity. We have to continually be adding new genetics and swapping between other reserves so that we don't get inbred animals. And that's something that obviously takes a lot of time and effort as well. And interestingly, we've done a lot of research to look at what happens to the other species in these reserves. So when we add these threatened species, they benefit and they increase in numbers, but what happens to the actual species that were there to start with? And this little sand slider on the left there, and there's a desert banner snake on the right, on the bottom, sorry, you can see that inside the reserve on the left, there's less of them. And if you look outside the reserve on the right, there's more of them. So these animals have actually not benefited from these fence conservation reserves, probably because they either get eaten by the reintroduced species, like the bilbies, or because the habitat has changed and it's no longer suitable for them. So not all species will benefit when we do these rewilding projects. And one of the other things we found is that you can be too successful, and in some cases that can lead to problems. These bettongs, we had 30 bettongs that we started with. We got to 6,000 bettongs about 16 years later, and that started to create issues with overbrowsing. And we started to see a lot of vegetation damage within the fence reserves from these things. So things like this native plum, which is really palatable species. You can see from the graph that as bettong numbers went up, the damage to this plum species also went up, and we had to start doing things to try and control the bettong population, introduce predators and move animals to other areas. And it's not just us that has these issues. This is one of the exclosures in the Netherlands. Don't ask me to pronounce it. I'm sure there's someone in the audience who know how to pronounce that, but it's not me. And they've had issues as well where they've reintroduced herbivores, large herbivores to areas, and ended up with them starving to death or having to be shot. So, there are these population issues that then have effects on the ecosystem. You still get failures inside fence reserves as well. So even though you fenced out the cats and foxes and the rabbits, we've had issues with stick nest rats, the habitat at Wild Deserts, another reintroduction site, no longer suitable. And that's probably because it's 150 years of overgrazing by sheep in that area, because it was a pastoral station. Numbats and womber pythons being eaten by native predators like birds of prey and other snakes. And red-tailed phascogales at Secret Rocks here where I live, trying to release them, but because they were captive bred, a lot of them couldn't find food after release and died. So you still get failures inside fenced reserves. And really, we see fenced reserves as a stepping stone to getting animals back out into the wider landscape. So yes, we need them for insurance populations. We need them to sort of get animals back out, adapting to the natural environment. But really, we're trying to get them beyond the fence into these managed landscapes. And that's really a lot of focus of my research, is to try and widespread recovery over more of Australia. So how do we get things beyond the fence and real true rewilding, which is back out into those open landscapes? And really, feral cat and fox predation is one of the biggest issues we have. And part of that is because our native species haven't co-evolved with these predators. So they haven't co-evolved appropriate anti-predator behaviours, and they can't seem to work out how to avoid or escape from these predators. And so one of the things we looked at was addressing this naivety in these prey species. And you can see here, this is a burrowing bettong, and you can practically go up and touch it. So if you were a cat or a fox, you wouldn't have any trouble eating this animal. And we tried to release these animals outside our recovery, and they just got eaten by cats and foxes. And this is a bilby here, and this was a video, but it doesn't look like it's going to work either, which is a bit unfortunate. Not really sure why it's not going to let me do that. It was just basically showing that you could get right up to this bilby while it was digging, and it wouldn't even notice you were there. So cat or a fox would have no trouble actually finding that either. Here's also, just see if I press this, if it will work. No, this is also a bettong, which was a video. Again, I can't seem to work out how to get that to work. Anyway, it was a bettong at a feeding tray. We would put these feeding trays down and video them to look at how close we could get them and what sort of vigilance behaviour they have. Very, very low. They'd basically jump straight in the bucket, stick their head down and start eating, and be pretty unaware of the surroundings. So we started thinking about how we might train these animals to be more aware of predators. And people have done things in the past, like squirt animals with water pistols and try and associate an unpleasant experience with a model cat or a fake picture of a fox. And it hasn't really worked. So we thought about trying something a bit different, where we'd actually going to expose them to real predators over long time periods and try and sort of accelerate natural selection and try and get them to adapt to living with cats and foxes. We called this in situ predator training, and it did involve putting cats in with bettongs and bilbies. And this was something that was quite hard and difficult to come to terms with originally, because we spent all of our time and effort getting rid of the cats and foxes, and now we wanted to put them back in. Like a very strange thing to do. Luckily, at Arid Recovery, we have all these different exclosures, and we were able to actually manipulate that. So we kept a lot of the areas predator-free, and we had bilbies and bettongs in there with no predators. We had one paddock where we called it our predator exposure paddock, and we had low densities of cats. So we would add 1 or 2 cats to that area. And we're talking about 25 square paddocks. Not small areas. They're very big areas. We'd put 600 bettongs in there with 1 or 2 cats. And then we had a release site up the top where we would take animals that had been exposed to predators and ones that hadn't, and we'd release them in there and compare their survival and their behaviour and see if what we were doing was actually working. So we moved bilbies and bettongs into the exclosure there, and we added cats, and we started monitoring them over time. We found some really interesting results. So when we looked at the bilbies that had been exposed to cats for several years, we took them out, we did some behavioural tests on them and compared them to the ones that hadn't been exposed. We found that they spent a lot more time under cover, under vegetation, and they really reduced their movement. They were a lot warier of going out to the open, and they spent a long time sort of hiding in bushes and creeping around the edge of vegetation, compared to those ones that hadn't been in with cats. We thought, oh, that's pretty good. It looks like they've improved their behaviour. So we released them into another area where there were cats. We got increased survival after release. So we basically showed and we managed to demonstrate that, yes, if you expose them to low levels of predators for a year or so, that actually led to greater survival of the animals once you release them into areas where there were predators. So that was pretty exciting because it showed that even a couple of years of exposure actually made a difference, and it was sort of like a proof of concept that worked. We did the same thing with burrowing bettongs. This animal's a bit different. It's been isolated on islands in Western Australia for quite a long time. All the mainland ones are extinct, so probably coming from a lower base in terms of being a lot dopier, a lot more island syndrome, we call it. But we looked at things like how do they behave in the traps. How we did things called a flight initiation distance. So that's basically how close can we get to them before they flee. And we looked at their movement behaviour over time once we'd exposed them to cats. And we found some really interesting results. So after 5 years of exposure, the population was still present and still increasing and still there. And we found those cat-exposed animals, they became larger. So we were getting selection for larger body size. They were warier, much harder to approach. We'd try and get close to them and they'd run away. They got quieter in the traps, so they hid in the back of the traps when we approached rather than bouncing around and making a lot of noise. And when we tested their escape behaviour, they were much more reactive. So as soon as you let them out of the bag, they were off. Whereas the ones that hadn't been exposed to cats sort of sat there and looked around and that sort of stuff. So we did manage to find these quite amazing differences in behaviour between the two groups. And then when we did release them into areas where there were cats, we found that those larger bettongs did survive. There was that selection for increased body size. So cats were obviously taking the smaller animals and the larger ones were surviving and reproducing and becoming even larger again. So the initial results do suggest that threatened species can tolerate some level of predation. They managed to survive in there with some cats, which was great. And we did manage to show that selection was occurring. So this might take decades or it might even take 100 years, but it does show that we really need to make sure that we don't isolate these animals behind fences and keep them away from threatened predators. We really need to be getting them out in the wild and trying to get them to coexist. So I also wanted to talk about another method we use to try and get rewilding happening on a larger scale, and that's aerial 1080 baiting. And there's two projects that have really managed to use aerial baiting to try and get rewilding happening. One's at Madawa in Western Australia, where they've managed to get bilbies surviving over broad landscapes of thousands of square kilometres. And one's the Flinders Ranges with the western quoll and possum reintroduction. And that's the one that I've been involved in that I wanted to talk briefly about. There's a lot of talk about 1080 and a lot of misinformation out there about 1080, and there's a lot of calls for banning its use, and a lot of people get very upset about the use of 1080 baiting. So 1080 is monosodium fluoroacetate, and fluoroacetates are naturally found in a lot of Australian plants, including gastrolobians and also including some acacias. And this map shows the gastrolobian distribution of the plant, the gastrolobian plant. You can see there's a lot of them in Western Australia and some in Northern Territory and a few in Queensland. And there's really not very many in New South Wales and Tasmania and Victoria. And what that means is that animals that have co-evolved with gastrolobians in those areas, they have a really high tolerance to fluoroacetate. And those areas where there's not many gastrolobian plants, the tolerance is a lot less. So if you take the brush-tailed possum, for example, in Western Australia, their LD50, which is how much 1080 is required to kill half of the animals, is 125 milligrams per kilogram. And in the eastern part of Australia, it's 0.75. So it's about 160 times more tolerant in the west than the east. So this is why 1080 gets used a lot in Western Australia and South Australia and Northern Territory, because it has a lot less non-target issues than in the eastern states. So I use 1080 in South Australian areas where it can be used safely, where there's little non-target impact. And so it's sort of on a case-by-case basis with where 1080 is used. And it was really important for this reintroduction of Western quolls in South Australia. And this was a project that was initiated by the Department for Environment through their Bounce Back program and occurred on the lands of the Adnyamathanha people. And this was the animal, the Western quoll. It's a beautiful animal. It's about 1 kilogram to 2 kilograms in size. It's called Chudich in Western Australia, and the Indigenous Adnyamathanha word for it in South Australia is idnya. And it used to be found over about 70%, or probably more than that, 80% of Australia. You can see that green, red and blue, and it's now found right in the southwest corner of Western Australia. So it was really about trying to get this species back out into the broader landscape, particularly in South Australia where it had gone extinct. So the Ikura Flinders Ranges National Park is nearly 1,000 square kilometres, very large reserve. It's jointly managed by the Department of Environment and the Adnyamathanha traditional owners. And they were very keen to bring the idnya back. The Western quoll is in the Dreamtime stories of the Adnyamathanha people. They've got a story about how it got its spots. And the story is that the quoll eloped with the goanna, and they were from the same tribal groups, and they weren't supposed to marry. So the elders got really angry and they followed the goanna and the Western quoll over most of South Australia, and they finally got them in the Flinders Ranges and they speared the quoll, and that's how the quoll got its spots. So they were really excited about getting the Western quoll back into South Australia. And the National Park has been doing long-term fox control using 1080 aerial baits for over 20 years. And when we got cameras out there, we could tell that there was not a single fox on camera. They did a really good job. And foxes were supposed to be the main issue for Western quolls and supposed to be one of the main reasons for their decline across Australia. So we got 93 Western quolls and released them over 3 years. We flew over to Western Australia, we caught them. We did a wild-to-wild translocation, which is supposed to be better than using captive bred animals, a bit more on the ball. And we radio collared them and we released them. And we found, they found shelter sites really well. We got over 500 shelter sites recorded. They went into rabbit warrens, they went under rock ledges, they went into tree hollows and logs. They didn't seem to have any trouble at all finding shelters, which was really good to know after not being there for 150 years. We also had a lot of breeding. We had 99% of females with pouch young. They have 6 pouch young once a year. And when the young get to about this size, they deposit them in a den until they're old enough to come out of the den and roam around and learn how to hunt. We also had young surviving. This is a mother at the entrance of her den, and she's got a young one coming out there and another one trying to climb on her back. So we definitely had young surviving dispersal, and that was also really, really positive. Unfortunately, though, we did find really high deaths after release, and we found about 1/3 died within only 3 months of release. So the average survival of our radio-collared quolls was less than 1 year. This was one of the ones we found dead on the ground. And unfortunately, the culprit was the feral cat. And in all cases, it was actually feral cat predation that was causing most of the deaths of those quolls. And we were able to discover that by swabbing the quolls for DNA, the carcasses and the radio collars, sending it off to the DNA lab, and they'd come back and say, yep, it's tested positive for cat. And we found this a bit strange in some ways, because quolls are quite large. They're not really a small animal. They're not like a little rodent. The males can get to 2 kilos. And that's quite a large animal for a cat to kill. And they can be quite aggressive. They're not sort of docile animals. They could stand up for themselves. So we were quite interested to know, well, what's going on? Why were these cats? What sort of cats were killing these quolls? So we got our sort of CSI Miami glasses on, and we decided to try and identify who actually was killing these quolls, not just what species, but actually what individuals were killing them. So we managed to actually genotype the DNA from those collars and from the carcasses and match it to cats that we've removed from the area from trapping and shooting. So we were removing, hundreds of cats from that area over that time, and we took DNA samples from all of those cats that we removed, and we were able to match them in most cases to the quoll had died. What we found was really interesting. We found that there was only certain cats that were actually killing the quolls, and these were large male cats in good condition. So it wasn't the female cats, it wasn't the small cats, it was almost exclusively these large male cats. And that sort of makes sense. If you're trying to kill an animal that's 1 or 2 kilos and can be quite aggressive, you've got to be a large animal in pretty good condition that's at the top of your game. So as we went on, we found this is survival rates of radio-collared quolls over time. You can see it really dropped after each time we released them. We'd see the same pattern where these cats would start killing them, and then we'd have this accelerated death of quolls. And the other thing that we had was we had an increasing male bias in the population. So over time, even though we were taking out 350 feral cats over a couple of years, we started to catch more and more males and less females. And quolls are what we call sexually dimorphic, which means they have different sizes for different sexes. So the males are about 2 kilos and the females are about 1 kilo. So these large male cats, they were taking out the females preferentially rather than the males. So we started getting really worried because we thought, well, we're not going to have any animals breeding. We're just going to end up with extinction, population extinction. So we were aerial baiting for foxes, but when you aerial bait for foxes, cats don't normally take poison baits. They like to eat live prey rather than dried meat baits, which are put out for foxes. But we started looking at a special bait that they developed in Western Australia, which is called an Eradicat sausage bait. It still has 1080 in it, but it's a soft medium. It's like a little chipolata sausage. So we started putting some sort of non-poisoned baits out in the environment. And there's a bait here in the middle bottom of the screen, and you can see this cat has just sort of walked straight past it, not interested in taking that bait at all. And unfortunately, we found that about 25% of the baits that we put out were actually taken by quolls, and only 2% were taken by cats. So there wasn't a lot of take by cats, but we thought, well, it could still be worth trialing. But we were worried about these quolls taking quite a lot of the baits. They had a fairly high resistance to the baits, so they shouldn't die if they take the baits, but we sort of weren't sure. So we started trying to hide baits in areas that cats couldn't get to. But unfortunately, wherever we put a bait, a quoll managed to climb up and grab it. So there was nowhere in the environment that we could actually put a bait where a cat couldn't reach it. So we started doing some poison bait trials, and we had radio-collared quolls, and we put some poison baits out in the environment. And we found that 9 quolls did take baits, but we didn't get a single death after them taking 1 or even multiple baits. So it seemed like they had a very high resistance to the 1080 and would hopefully be okay if we decided to go ahead with this special cat baiting. And that's what we did. We did some Eradicat baiting at 50 baits per square kilometre, and we radio-collared cats and quolls, and we did it over 3 years. And we wanted to see if this would help the quoll population, reverse the decline and start to increase again. And what we found was we had nearly 90% mortality rate in cats, which was, a big win in terms of quoll survival. And we were able to take those cats out after each baiting event. This graph here shows the survival of the radio-collared cats after baiting. These are all feral cats that were caught in the local park.
Sorry.
And
Catherine,
yeah?
would you mind if I interrupted? We've just got a screen failure in effect here. The McAfee antivirus system is trying to sell us stuff.
Oh, no worries. I can go back a slide and wait for you to sort that out.
Yep. And you've got to select it. Oh, don't show this again. Very good. Okay. That's okay. Okay, thank you. We can start again. Oh,
We're
keep
back
going.
on?
Thank you, Catherine.
Okay, yep. So I
We've
was
got
just saying that we managed to have quite a high mortality rate for cats, and after each baiting event, we had almost 90% decline in cats. The other thing that was really interesting is that when we looked at where these cats were, where we were getting the highest mortality in cats was actually where we didn't have very many rabbits. So when there was a lot of rabbits in the environment, the number of cats that would take baits was a lot less. So it really did show that cats prefer to hunt that live prey like rabbits, but when they weren't available, they would take the baits and die. Good news for the quolls was we didn't have any quolls dying from 1080 baiting. So we had radio-collared quolls each year, and some of them were still being killed by cats before and after baiting, but the numbers were a lot less than was happening before we started cat baiting. So in the end, the sex ratio of quolls returned to parity. We started having 1-to-1 male to female sex ratio after we aerial baited. We had an increase in quolls that we caught on camera and that we detected through trapping. And basically 10 years after we've released the quolls, they're still extant and they're increasing both in numbers and distribution. So they're now found over a lot more area of the park, and they're starting to expand out into the pastoral areas around the outside. So that was really successful, and I guess an example of when you can use 1080 baiting safely to protect a threatened species and actually get them back outside of fenced reserves. So when we talk about reducing predator impacts in rewilding projects, I talked about exclusion fencing, I talked about the predator training that we did, I've talked about the poison baiting, and there's two other techniques that we're sort of looking at the moment. One is using these Felix grooming traps, and one is using population protecting implants. So the Felix grooming trap is a device that was invented by John Reed, and it basically squirts a 1080 paste onto the cat's fur or the fox's fur, and then they ingest the poison through compulsory grooming. And it's one way of just reducing those non-part target impacts. So it doesn't squirt poison on any native animal. It only can detect that it's a cat and squirts the poison onto them. So you can put them across roadways or along fence lines, and they can detect things up to 4 meters away, and they squirt out at about 60 meters a second, which is really, really fast. And they've got this really clever array of sensors which detects the shape and the size of the animal and only fires if it detects that it's a cat. And you can see on the right hand side there, you can see the poison actually squirting out onto the cat's fur, and then it goes away and grooms it. And we're trialing at the moment different toxins. There's a new toxin called PAP, which is supposed to be a lot more ethical. The animal just sort of falls asleep. So we're trialing PAP as a new alternative toxin to 1080, and we're seeing whether that also works with feral cats and foxes. I did have a video of this working, but for some reason, I don't know if it's a Zoom thing, but it's not, none of the videos have been working, so I apologize for that. The other new method that we're working on is a population protecting implant, and this is based on gastrolobium seeds in the environment. And the early settlers noticed that the pigeons would eat the gastrolobium seeds, and then any of their pet cats that ate the pigeons would die. And so they were unable to keep pet cats in a lot of parts of southwest Western Australia because they died every year whenever the gastrolobium seeds were ripe. So we started thinking about, well, how can we sort of turn this into a method that we might be able to use to protect threatened species through secondary poisoning? And we've invented this little microchip. It's a tiny little microchip, and it contains 1080 or any toxin that you want, and you inject it under the skin of your native species, which has a high tolerance to 1080, and it sits there inert under the skin, just like a microchip that you put in your cat or your fox. But if it's eaten by a cat or a fox, then the outer coating breaks down and it releases the toxin into the cat's stomach, and then the cat or the fox dies. So the good thing about this is that the 1080 is contained again, and it's not out there in the environment for all birds and other mammals to eat. And it also is only targeting those cats and foxes that are actually killing your threatened species. So as we showed before, it was those large male cats that were doing the damage, and the small, younger female cats weren't doing any of the damage. So this is really a way of just targeting specific predators that are actually doing the damage in wildlife conservation. So finally, I get asked a lot by people, what can we do right now to protect threatened species? And, you know, how can we help basically get these animals back out and reverse the decline that we're seeing in threatened species in Australia? And one of the things is about supporting cat and fox control programs and the use of 1080 where it's appropriate, and not, you know, calling for the blanket ban on 1080, but actually understanding the facts and looking at where 1080 can be used safely and supporting that. And another one is about improving land condition. There's a lot of rhetoric at the moment about kangaroo harvesting and how it's really inhumane, and that's untrue. And also reducing that grazing pressure from sheep and cattle in our rangelands that cause a lot of decline in land condition. And the reason that's important is when we were looking in the Flinders Ranges here, this is the survival of quolls in different areas. And the red is in areas where there's higher structural complexity, so a lot of understory, a lot of undergrowth, a lot of vegetation cover. And the survival of quolls in that habitat was a lot higher than in areas with low structural complexity. So the photo down the bottom is areas where there's a lot of kangaroo grazing, where there's been sheep grazing. It's very open. It's much easier for predators to hunt in those environments and to kill animals in those environments. So the more we can make vegetation more complex, more intact, less degraded, the less impact we have from cats and foxes. So, you know, that's really important to remember. That's not about just killing cats and foxes. It's about trying to maintain that land condition. And these are some exposures that are from pastoral properties and Flinders Ranges, where you can see inside the exposure how much cover and grass is in there compared to outside. And you can just imagine if you're a bandicoot or a small mammal trying to survive outside where there's sheep and cattle and kangaroos in overabundance, it's going to be a lot harder than inside where those animals aren't there. So maintaining that land condition is just super important. And just finish with one of my favourite threatened species. This is the numbat. We have actually reintroduced them to Secret Rocks here. And I was just out this afternoon catching one to change its radio collar, and it's put on weight, and it's got juveniles in the pouch. So it's all going really well. But thank you very much for having me come and talk to your group, and I'm happy to answer questions or have a discussion about anything you're interested in.
Well, that was fantastic, Katherine, and I'm sure it's raised a lot of questions in people's minds about the complexity of the project and the ingeniousness of your solutions to the problems that you encounter. So, has anybody got a question? Deb, could you come up here and?
Hi, Katherine. Debbie, Andrew, great to talk. Yeah, so I'm very interested in your Felixer machine, and can distinguish apparently the western quoll from the cat, and can it be trained to distinguish other species distinctively, because other quolls or other things that we want to protect? So does it actually identify the kind of image, the whole complexity of the animal, or is it just doing it on the height above the ground and length of the tail or something like that?
So the research that's been done shows it's got a 99% accuracy. So only 1% of animals will get targeted. Occasionally malleefowl will get targeted, and occasionally kangaroos if they're on all fours leading forward. But they're developing a new AI. So instead of using sensors now, they're using an AI technology where they're looking at using a camera, and the camera then can be trained to basically reject, any species that you want it to reject, and to fire on any species that you want it to fire on. So if it was, another species that you were interested in, like foxes or that sort of thing. So yeah, the technology is definitely there. It's not just the height of the sensors, but it's the movement pattern as well at the moment. So without the AI cameras, it's the order in which the sensors are broken and the timing of the break, because we've trained it on so many feral cats that it works out really well. And it also has a mode called a conservative mode, where if it's not sure, it doesn't fire. So sometimes, you can set it on that and it will miss the odd cat, but normally if a cat walks past once, it'll walk past again. And then if it's sure that time, it'll fire on it. So yeah, it's very clever, and it's highly target specific.
And just quickly, I did miss in the confusion back then, what was the bait that you're killing the cats so successfully with? It was 1080 just delivered in a sausage, or not?
Yeah, it's called a Eradicat bait. It was developed by the Western Australian government. They've got a sort of a soft sausage, and it's got these herbs and spices that they've patented, like a sort of a secret recipe. And it doesn't always work, but when there's not a lot of alternative prey around, it can be really successful. So in the Flinders, in the areas where there wasn't many rabbits, it was very successful. We've tried it at our recovery and it didn't work very well because we have too many rabbits and there's too many live prey for the cats. But in certain situations, it works very well.
Okay, thank you. That's fantastic. Thanks very much.
Katherine, we've got a few questions coming in on the chat line, if you'd like to have a look at that. There's one from an MA. Can I read it out? Yeah. Okay. I haven't got it here.
The question is, Katherine, are you doing anything to improve the vegetation structure? I think relating to one of those last slides you showed.
Yeah, we do. At Secret Rocks, we have removed about 10,000 goats from the region, and we also shoot kangaroos under a destruction permit that is administered by the Department for Environment. They come out and we monitor the vegetation and decide, how many kangaroos we need to control. We have a kangaroo industry in South Australia, but the harvesters only shoot about 20% of the quota, so they never shoot enough to actually, make a difference or to fulfill anywhere near their quota. So kangaroos are still a major issue there. We also exclude sheep and cattle from our property. But yeah, it's more what we can do across the broader landscape. I mean, half of Australia is pastoral land. So there's half of Australia that could be managed more sustainably if we could reduce some of that pressure from sheep and cattle. But instead of reducing that pressure, a lot of that pressure is actually increasing, because when they invented polypipe, they can now roll out polypipe across whole large, vast areas of the desert, and they can pipe water there from underground wells across large areas. And that just means the areas that sheep and cattle can access have increased over the last 20 or 30 years. And now some pastoral stations are what we call fully watered, where cattle and sheep can access every square inch of that station, and there's really no areas protected from grazing.
Any others from the audience here? Okay.
Katherine, Adrian back. You've been studying for decades the landscape, but the bushfires, particularly out in the arid zones, have had a dramatic impact. Can you just give us a comment on what you've seen and how is what's the recovery like for all the species?
Yeah, well, our property here, we lost 50% in the 2019-20 summer bushfires, which were, catastrophic on the east coast of Australia. So we had really large, hot fires that burnt half of our property, and it really showed us how important it is to do patch burning across our property. The only reason we didn't lose 100% of our property is because we had done some patch burning, and those 2 fires that we got in that summer, they pulled up at the patch burning that we'd done. And if we hadn't done that patch burning, we would have lost the entire property. So it really has brought home how important doing a lot more small, regular fires, cool season burns is. And it's a bit easier for us to do it here because we don't have a highly populated landscape. But in parts of Eastern Australia where you have, you know, so many people living in so many farms, it was very, very difficult to try and do the patch burning that's required to stop those catastrophic fires. So it's definitely an ongoing issue. We ramped up our kangaroo control after the fires and our goat control to try and allow vegetation recovery. And we did notice in areas where that hasn't been done, you get a dramatically different vegetation community coming back after fire because all the palatable species have been eaten out. So yeah, the importance of that herbivore control after fire is really brought home by some of that work.
Have another go, Deb? Yeah, come up.
Hi, Catherine, Debbie back. I wanted to ask you, what is the situation with dingoes in your reserves? Do you have a position on either favouring them or discouraging them, and their impact on the other predators, the cats, foxes and quolls? And would the baiting programs actually act to remove them from that landscape?
So the 2 projects in the Flinders and Secret Rocks, they're below the dog fence. So dingoes are controlled below the dog fence, or they're supposed to be eradicated. So we don't have dingoes at those 2 projects, unfortunately, because they've been eradicated. Dingoes are one of those issues that are really polarizing. People either hate dingoes or they love them. And, you know, I'm definitely in the middle. We have evidence that they do control cats and foxes in a lot of arid areas. There are areas that are more wooded where it's more difficult for dingoes to control them. So the cats can climb trees and get away from the dingoes and they can hide. But certainly in those open outback areas, they do control cats and foxes quite effectively. And so a lot of the pastoral lands north of the dog fence, we're trying to maintain dingo numbers in those landscapes. But we are fighting a losing battle with pastoralists because, you know, as they intensify their pastoral activities, they're also a lot more keen to bait dingoes regularly, which is something that, yeah, I definitely do not support.
Yeah, thank you.
Janine, would you like to unmute your microphone and ask another question?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Catherine. That was fascinating. I was really interested to hear about your start of the project, which was the introduction of the calicivirus and how that sort of created a thought about taking advantage of the situation. I thought that was very interesting. The other question I have is, how do you react, or how do your neighbours react to the project? Are they supportive, or is it a problem in your management of other animals?
No, we have a lot of support. I think a lot of farmers obviously want to control their foxes anyway because of their lambs. A lot of them have too many kangaroos that are, you know, eating their crops and things. So when we first started working down here at Secret Rocks, a lot of our neighbours were quite surprised that we were talking about controlling kangaroos, and they thought we were sort of greenies and we wouldn't want to kill any animals and that sort of stuff. So I think conservation biologists and landholders can have a lot in common. There's obviously some, you know, points of difference, but yeah, we do have a lot of good support from the local landholders because they can see the mutual benefits as well. Most of the time, not always. Certainly less support for leaving dingoes alone in some quarters. Up at Arid Recovery, we have the Kokatha Corporation, who own land next to Arid Recovery, and we're working with them to try and get these animals outside the fence onto their traditional lands as well. So they're highly supportive, which is great.
Thank you.
Over to Jennifer Baxter. Would you like to unmute and ask your question, please?
Hi, thanks for your work everywhere. Really appreciate it, Katherine. Long-time supporter of projects on Kangaroo Island as well. My question is whether future AI camera-driven felixer groomers would be clever enough to identify a rabbit from, say, a quoll, and whether rabbits have the grooming habit which would enable effective use of felixer groomers on rabbits.
Yeah, that's a really good question. They would be smart enough, absolutely, and you could train the AI camera to target rabbits. There was a control mechanism that they trialed for rabbits where it was sort of like a creosote sticky paste that they would put at the entrance of the warrens with 1080 in it or poison in it, and the rabbits would get it on their paws as they went into the warren, and then they would groom it off and die. So I can't see why it wouldn't be something that would be definitely worth trialing for rabbits to see if they would groom it off their fur, and if so, then that's another amazing use that could be put to the felixer. So yeah, that's a really good suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I think there's no more questions. So I'd like to say thank you so much, Katherine, for presenting here tonight. It's been a fascinating story, and over such a long time, you've been totally dedicated to this this project for a long time, and you've seen the ups and downs. And I admire your tenacity in carrying through this project and seeking to pursue it further into the future. It's a wonderful exposure of science that comes into it, and psychology of animals, all sorts of features, which means you've got to come up with ingenious tricks and traps to get rid of the predators. So really appreciate you speaking here tonight, and I'd just like to say thank you so much for your presentation, and ask the audience to give you a round of ovation.
Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank your society for your generous support of some of my students too. I think one of my students is working on numbats and has had your support. Another one, I think, on bilbies. So, I think it's great that people can support students with their research, because some of this research is really important. It's hard for students, especially with field work, to get funding to, pay for fuel and getting out in the field and equipment and stuff. So thank you very much for your support for students as well.
That's great. Thank you.
I'll leave you to the rest of your meeting. Thank you very much.
Katherine, good night.
Good night.
Yeah.